Welcome back from spring break, probably the most unforgettable spring break of your life because we're, as you know, completely online now with classes through the end of the semester, and there's a worldwide pandemic going on. Hopefully after the semester things will get better, or they'll at least kind of level off a little bit, but for now that's where we're at. So that's why I've created this YouTube channel where I'm going to post this lecture and the rest of the lectures that I would have given throughout the semester if we could meet in person on Mondays and Wednesdays. I'm going to try to record and post those as fast as possible so that way, as soon as you can, you'll have the whole semester that you can watch and listen to kind of at your own, within your own, on your own schedule. I am going to do, the rest of your grade is going to be a little different because I'm not going to do just 2 big exams. I'm going to probably break it into about half a dozen smaller quizzes that I'll expect you to complete at home by a certain day and time. So you'll have some flexibility as to when to complete as to when to listen to the lectures, but you'll want to listen to them, whenever at the time whenever the next quiz pertains to that, to the last couple of lectures that I put out there. But I'll let you know well ahead of time before I'm about to send you some graded material. So you'll know what's coming and you'll know that it's time to review these recordings. So before I move into the next section of material, I'm just going to pull up the syllabus real quick. Before that, I'm going to kind of shrink myself down here so that I'm not, you don't have to look at me entirely, but you won't completely miss me either. All right, so this is our syllabus. It should look familiar. As you can see, we're not meeting together anymore. We're meeting on YouTube, and pretty much any time, within the framework of when the quizzes will be due, you can kind of complete these lectures on your own time, and that's the silver lining of homeschooling, is that you have some more flexibility. If you're not in the mood to hear me talk about contracts on a Monday at 2:30, then you don't have to. You can listen to me Tuesday morning or Monday night, whenever. All right, so you can see here we've been through our first unit, the first 4 chapters in our first exam, and then we went through the next 4 chapters and we had our second unit exam. So that put us halfway through the semester, roughly, and your grade. And then, this is where we're at now. So we had spring break, that's where we last met each other. And you have a little space here because you had a little extended spring break. And then from there, the world started falling apart. And so this schedule is pretty much gone at this point, and I just need you to, as it says right here, refer to my emails for information about the online classes and information about any future assignments and things that I may ask you to do or things that I may ask you to look at. Also, again, this is your, let's see, this is how your grade was originally. This is kind of where it was at when we left, about 45% you've already taken care of. The other, roughly half of your grade will be determined based on these assignments that I think up. I'm still sort of thinking about what I want to do. So I want to make it useful, but I also want to make it fair and engaging with you being in the situation that we're in. where many of you are quarantined completely, and a couple of you are in completely different time zones, and at least one or two of you are in different countries. So, yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up the PowerPoint here and get started with a little introduction, and then I've got a little video I'm gonna let you watch, and also some of these recordings, I may go a little bit shorter than normal class time, but I may go a little bit longer too, because it's a recording, so you can skip over if I'm rambling on about something. You can fast forward, you can rewind if you need to hear me say something again. So I'm just going to say and show what I think needs to be conveyed. So this is a chapter on contract law. This is chapter 10, and chapter 11 is also on contract law, but it's about a specific type of contract that just deals with the sale of goods, which are tangible and movable objects, like a truckload of t-shirts, or a truckload of oranges, or just things that can be moved around that you would pick off a shelf and purchase, as opposed to contracts generally where you are performing a service for somebody, like you contract to build a house for somebody, or to mow their lawn, or to wash their car, or to perform at a concert for their birthday party or something like that. Services, as opposed to just exchanging movable items. And the reason this is important is because both chapters are going to deal with the same set of rules, but in the next chapter they're going to be the same rules that are tweaked a little bit, because for goods contracts, the rules are meant to be tweaked in a way that makes them a little bit easier to form, and a little less formal in terms of the application of rules that tell us how to form and how to go about enforcing contracts. So you're going to learn a bunch of general rules here in chapter 10, but I need you to keep in mind that all those rules for testing purposes in chapter 11, when we talk about goods contracts, those rules are going to have a sister rule, basically, that's very similar but is a little bit different. So you'll want to start thinking about probably making a flashcard for each of the rules that tells you what the rule is in chapter 10, and then what it is in chapter 11 for the same situation. So the book starts by noting that contract law is primarily common law, and we know this from chapter 1. The difference is that common law is made by judges. It comes from judicial opinions that have been passed down, in this case and many others, from hundreds of years ago, starting with courts in England, and decisions that existed. Some of them existed before this country's founding, as opposed to statutory law that is sort of deliberated on by the legislatures. And just like the law of torts, which is also rooted in common law, we also have a restatement of contracts that summarizes those rules, so you don't have to go looking through all the case law and try to kind of summarize it yourself. You can kind of skip ahead to the restatement. So what is a contract? You guys probably have some basic understanding of this. It's when essentially someone, two people agree to do things for each other, and it's when a situation like that arises that warrants a judge and society to expect the two of you to make good on whatever you promise to exchange or do for one another, so that you can't go back on your promise, right? So the book says It's an agreement supported by sufficient consideration to do or refrain from doing some particular thing. So, you could promise somebody to do something for them, like wash your car or wash their car, or to refrain from doing something like, maybe refrain from building a building on a piece of land that somebody doesn't want you to for whatever reason. So it can be either doing something or agreeing to not do something that you otherwise would be perfectly legally allowed to do. And that's really what this underlined section here is at the top. It says consideration. That's really what consideration is. It's this giving up of something to somebody else that you don't otherwise owe them, right? It's just this sort of exchange of liberties between two people. This slide, you can also see that these such agreements can be expressed, they can be implied. One important point I want to make at the beginning, and we'll get back to it when we talk about the statute of frauds, is that there's a misconception among some people that to be a valid contract, one of the requirements is that it must be in writing, right, and signed by both parties. And if it's not, then one of the parties can get away with it because it wasn't put down in writing. And that's actually not the general rule. There is a specific rule that says when contracts have to be in writing. There's a certain set of contracts, it's 6 types of contracts that have to be in writing to be enforceable. But other than those 6, the general rule is that you can have an oral contract. If all the other elements are there, then you can have an agreement even if it's not in writing. Now, you don't have very good proof or very good evidence of it, but that doesn't mean that somebody can necessarily get away with breaking a contractual obligation to you just because it wasn't in writing. So I like to state that from the outset because I think it's a common misconception. And it is something, though, we'll get back to that as we move through this chapter. And that being said, I'm going to pull up a video here. This is from a professor at Harvard Law. Just a little introduction to get you thinking about, what we're thinking about when we think about people's contractual obligations.
Contracts are everywhere, not just some huge formal agreement between large corporations where one is going to buy the other, so on. Although that's what something like that looks like. But as a matter of fact, it's everywhere. You go through them, I don't know how many times in the course of a day. You go into a parking garage, they give you a stub. Now, that's a contract. They're going to look after your car, more or less, and you're going to pay them. You walk into your dry cleaners and you drop off your suit, and the person behind the desk gives you a receipt. Well, that's important because that's how they're going to know which suit is yours. But that receipt is also a contract. And even if there wasn't a receipt, you're dropping it off there and coming back a couple of days later and picking up the suit. Well, they expect to get paid, and you expect to pay them. That's a contract. You walk into a restaurant. You order the steak and chips and everything else, and then you get the check and you pay it. You can't just say, well, that's very nice. Thank you very much for dinner. See you tomorrow. Understood between you was they're going to feed you and you're going to pay them. And so it goes. But it gets even less formal than that. I live in New England, and we have a lot of snowstorms in the winter. So what happens? It snows, and a bunch of local kids come, knock on your door, and say, Sir, can we shovel out your driveway and your walkway and so on? How much? $20. Okay. So they do it, and then they knock on the door, and they have a contract with you. You owe them $20. They didn't do that as a favor. Now it gets more complicated. Uh, you're out of town, and it snows. And while you're out of town, they come and they shovel out your driveway and do all that. And when you come back and they say, $20, please. Well, do you have a contract for that or not? We'll find out later whether you do or not. And what if it snows the way it did a couple of years ago, 18 inches? And they say, well, we had a lot of work to do, and they really did. This time you owe us $30. Do you owe them $30? All that is something we're going to try to understand. Now, you might ask, why do we have a Mooc on this? Why am I asking you to join me for really quite a number of sessions and quite a lot of work, your work, my work, on the subject of contracts? One thing I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to turn you into lawyers. I'm not going to teach you how to draft a contract or deal with a situation where somebody sues you or claims. That's not what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is for you to understand what's going on as you go through your lives in a jungle, or maybe not a jungle, a forest. It's not so unfriendly, of contracts. It's as if I were offering to teach you a course on the internal combustion engine. Now, this wouldn't be a course on how to fix your car when it breaks down or doesn't break down, but to know what's going on under the hood. So if your service station then tells you it's the transmission and that's going to cost you $1,500, you know what the transmission is, and you know whether it kind of makes sense for that to cost you $1,500. In other words, what I'd like to do when you're through with this is for you to understand this part of your environment.
Okay, let me just pull this back up here. All right, so you saw that sort of introduction to some scenarios where, you may feel like somebody owes you money, or they may feel like you owe them money or an obligation. But you can see how there are also situations where you may have had some disappointing expectations, like with the shoveling of the driveway. But there's a question as to whether or not the law or a judge should force that person to go through with that, which they said they would do, and whether or not they should really be, legally bound to do that thing that they weren't otherwise obligated to do, and be forced to do it against their will when they've changed their mind for whatever reason, or the circumstances have changed. So I'm going to kind of break here in a second so I can come back and start talking a little bit about really what makes a contract and what goes into it. But after we've seen that video, I'm going to read to you a couple of things from your book to have you think about, and one of them I actually talked to you about in class because there was something else that reminded me. But I want you to just think a little bit about these as just a reasonable person and how you would feel in these situations, right? So in the 12th edition, this is on page 246. under lighter side of the law. So it's titled No Extra Charge for the Smell. Syllabus, it says, bought a 4-year-old car from a dealership during the winter, and when the weather warmed up, the car began to smell. The warmer it got, the worse the smell. She took the car back to the dealership, and someone told her the smell was from a dead animal. Doubtful about that, she filed a claim with her insurance company. State Farm, her insurer, they hired a biohazard cleanup company. And that company determined that the odor was human. State Farm also learned that the car had been stolen 3 times and it had also been used as a rental vehicle. So Syllabus sued the dealership to undo the deal and return her money, plus extra money for her trouble. Obviously, having to go through the hassle of trying to figure out what it was to begin with before she could get the problem solved. So, how would you feel in that situation? You buy a car from a dealership. Obviously, no one mentions any of this to you. You go through all this hassle to find out even what the smell is, let alone where it came from or whose fault it is, and you find out it's human flesh. And it was used as a rental car as well. You didn't know that. And of course, she didn't know. I'm sure the dealer didn't talk to her about the fact that it was used or the fact that it was stolen. I'm sorry, it was stolen 3 times, and there was some sort of human odor in there. On page 254, this is the one I did talk to you about during our, I think, our property chapter. It's called You Can't Trust Anyone These Days. Fugitive murder suspect Jesse Dimmick was on the run when he broke into a home in Kansas and held a couple at knife point. While they were being held, the couple convinced Dimmick that they would hide him from the police if he paid them some money. So he agreed, and he fell asleep while watching a movie with the couple. The couple escaped, and Mr. Dimmick was shot when trying to escape from the police. Mr. Dimmick then sued the couple for $235,000 for breach of contract. Quote, as a result of the breach of the contract, I suffered a gunshot to my back, which almost killed me, he noted in his lawsuit. I asked the Rowleys, the couple whose home he broke into, to hide me because I feared for my life. I offered the Rowleys an unspecified amount of money which they agreed upon, thereby forging a legally binding oral contract. So again, before we get into these rules, I just ask you, what would you think? And I would go back to that question of reasonableness that I talked about at the beginning of the class. What would a reasonable person do, and what would a reasonable person expect in that situation? And I think when you think about that, and we talk about the rules of forming a contract, you'll see that they probably comport pretty well with the way that you would think about it, because that's what the law is all about. Doing what's most reasonable to other people, which in some cases is, or in many cases, is just doing simply what's logical under the circumstances and fair to everyone involved. So we'll come back in just a second, and I will continue on with the PowerPoint.